All right, well, we know that South Africa is one of the most unequal nations in the world, and that, of course, is entrenched when we look at the pay gap. A new bill, though, is in the works, which will amend the Companies Act to deal with fat cat salaries at the top and forced disclosure of high earners. Business Day this morning quoting a PwC report which shows that CEOs from the top 10 companies are each earning in the region of 24 million rand a year. That's eye-watering, but it's actually in line with what their peers in developed nations are getting. The question is, can we level the paying fields without a loss of top-earning talent that can simply sometimes go to another country to earn? Well, I'm joined now by Minister for Trade, Industry and Competition, Ebrahim Patel. Minister, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. You know, this bill sounds like a good idea. Right the wrongs of the pay gap. There does seem to be a global trend as well in this direction, more disclosure, more transparency. Realistically, how do you make sure we retain top talent and encourage international investment at the same time?
Well, thank you, and good evening, Sally. I think what we're setting out as a vision is building both a stronger economy and a fairer economy. And you've touched on the fairer economy. And just contextualizing the measures to deal with salaries, in the fairer economy part of our work, is really to encourage greater levels of worker ownership, as well as representation of worker interests in the boards of corporations, and finally shedding more light on issues of pay gaps. As you noted, and many commentators have made this point, that we have extraordinary levels of inequality in South Africa, measured by what is called the Gini coefficient, which aggregates data for a country as a whole. South Africa is one of the laggards when it comes to equity. And so if we want to build that stronger economy and a more inclusive economy, we've got to let all South Africans feel they have a stake in it. And that's really what this is about. Now, we're still finalizing the provisions of the Companies Amendment Bill. And as I indicated in Parliament yesterday, this will be completed within the next 60 days, and we will then have the bill in a form where it can go out for public comment and Cabinet can consider it. So I want to not anticipate too much the content of the bill, safe to say that our focus now is on better disclosure, say what the pay gaps are, and give shareholders a greater say over these matters, that in fact you can't have boards of companies alone making these decisions, and shareholders and indeed all stakeholders sitting with the outcome of it. Now, you've raised the question, how do we manage this that we don't lose South Africa's talent pool? And I think part of it is to recognize that if we are able to achieve the goals of a growing economy, and they are greater rewards for everybody, that goes a long way to this, because we're not focusing on the higher end only. It's really the gap between top and bottom that is just extraordinarily high, so high that we don't have the commitment in many workplaces to a shared future. And that means that even high-paid earners live in a society with greater levels of insecurity, higher levels of crime. There isn't that sense of inclusiveness. And so these measures are all about creating conditions. There are developing countries that have been able to retain a strong talent pool without these extraordinary levels of gaps between the top earners and the bottom earners. And we can learn some important lessons there. Mm-hmm. So the bill will not seek to overreach. It's not going to prescribe what the salaries should be, but it will put greater spotlight on what those gaps are in individual firms. And I should say, not every firm has these enormous gaps. And in not every instance are the salaries and the bonuses justified. We had an example recently of significant public comment on the bonuses and severance packages for the CEOs of Sasol, when they left the company, and the company was in dire straits. Sasol stood at the door of closure at one point, and yet there was no relationship between executive earnings and company performance. So these are really the matters that that the bill will seek to highlight without being over-prescriptive, and then give shareholders and society an opportunity to play a bigger role in setting, if you like, the acceptability tone in these kind of matters.
And it's a worthy goal, and the transparency, as you say, hopefully will lead to greater trust, because at the moment, certainly when we look at pay disputes, we see such distance sometimes between managers and workers. So it'll be really interesting to see that bill make its progress. As you say, it still needs to go for public comment. It's going to be a very big talking point, and I think an important conversation we need to have. I need to move on to the issue around vaccine availability, and this relates to your mission along with the WTO and Brazil, where you're trying to get these patents waived. We've just had concerning news from the India Serum, the Serum Institute of India, basically saying that they're battling to meet the demand. They might not be able to supply COVAX, and we know that COVAX is going to supply so many vaccines, or we hope they will, to Africa. Surely this sort of situation only adds to your argument. Is it going to help you push your argument, and have you made any progress since we last spoke?
Yes, indeed, Sally. When South Africa and India raised the proposal for a waiver in October last year, 1 million people had died. Today, it's more than 3 million people globally. And The Economist magazine estimates that, in fact, the real number may be significantly higher, probably about 10 million people. So that underlies the significance and the urgency of getting more supply of vaccine. The Serum Institute in India is a very large producer of vaccines, and anticipating that the infection rate in India would be contained and containable, much of their production was originally geared to supply the rest of the world. And when the Indian infection rates went up, the Serum Institute, of course, redirected more of its supplies to their domestic market. And what it really has reminded the world is our vulnerability when all of our supply chains are located offshore. It's a powerful point about diversifying supply chains, and this is a conversation that we're now having with many countries across the world. We've made some progress. There has been a number of developed countries that have signaled some degree of support for the position that South Africa has taken. The United States and New Zealand, of course, have come out firmly in favor of a waiver for vaccines. We are now in discussion with the European Union, and we hope we can make some progress. There was a statement that the Vice President of the European Union made in the European Parliament this morning, in which they indicated, at the very least, a commitment to assisting in the rapid scale-up of vaccine production on the African continent. And they've recognized that there are constraints in the rules relating to intellectual property in the World Trade Organization, and how far they would be able to stretch would be the subject of our future discussions. But that is a glimmer of hope of moving forward in building a consensus, a global consensus around the need for a waiver, for the sharing of know-how and technology transfers, so that the world can use its productive capabilities to ramp up production and have more people gaining access to the vaccine.
Absolutely, and thank you for correcting me. Of course, it was South Africa and India, not South Africa and Brazil, as I correctly said earlier. I have to ask you about alcohol, Minister, because I know that most of our viewers will be wondering if you can put on your trade hat for a moment.